I always thought the worst sound in the world was the alarm clock on a Monday morning, but I was wrong. The worst sound in the world is hearing your wife laugh, really laugh, in a way she hasn't with you in years, and realizing it's not for you. It's for someone else. It started on a Friday night, one of those rare evenings when Emily and I didn't have plans, and for once, she wasn't glued to her laptop or her phone. She had a glass of wine in her hand and was standing by the window in our living room, looking out into the backyard with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't directed at me. That was my first warning sign, though I didn't know it yet. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels, half paying attention to whatever she was watching on her phone, but something about the way she tilted her head, the way she bit her lip while listening, the way she held herself just a little differently, it made me uneasy. "Who were you talking to?" I asked casually, not even looking away from the TV. She turned around too quickly, like I had caught her doing something wrong, but her face smoothed over in an instant. "Just Sarah," she said, mentioning her best friend's name, the one she always used as an excuse when she wanted to be left alone. I nodded and let it go. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. That nothing became something 2 days later when I was taking out the trash. Our neighbors, Tom and Jessica, had a habit of throwing these small backyard gatherings on weekends, nothing fancy, just drinks and a fire pit, sometimes a barbecue. Emily and I had been invited countless times, but we rarely went. That night, I saw her standing by the fence, talking to someone over the low flicker of flames in their yard. I couldn't see who it was, but I could hear her voice, that same light, teasing tone she used when she wanted to get her way. "Stop it," she laughed, swatting at the air. "You're terrible." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and before I even had time to think, my feet were moving. I stepped off our patio, walked around the side of the house, and finally saw him. It was one of Tom's friends, a guy I'd seen once or twice before but never really talked to. Tall, well-dressed, a little too charming for his own good. He was leaning against the fence, drink in hand, smirking like he knew something I didn't. Emily saw me coming, and something flashed across her face: shock, guilt, maybe even anger that I had shown up uninvited into whatever little moment they were having. "Hey, babe," she said too quickly, her voice too high, too forced. "Tom's just introducing me to his friend, Jason." Jason turned to me, smiling like nothing was out of the ordinary, like he hadn't just been flirting with my wife in my own damn backyard. He extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, man." I shook it, maybe a little harder than I needed to, and didn't say anything. Emily's hand found my arm, squeezing just a little too tightly, like she wanted me to let it go, to not make a scene. And I didn't. Not yet. That night, I watched her. I watched the way she kept checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. I watched the way she left the room every time a notification buzzed, the way she smiled to herself after reading whatever was on the screen. She wasn't talking to Sarah. I knew that now, but I needed proof. 2 days later, I got it. Emily always went for a run in the morning, even though she hated running. She said it cleared her mind, that it was the only time she could be alone with her thoughts. Maybe that was true, once. But not anymore. That morning, I followed her. Not in an obvious way, just enough to see where she went. And sure enough, I saw him. Jason, waiting at the end of the trail, leaning against his car like he had all the time in the world. Emily slowed down when she saw him, her entire posture changing, softening. She pulled out her AirPods, tucking them into her pocket, and walked right up to him with that same smile, the one I hadn't seen in years. And then, right there, in broad daylight, she put her hands on his chest, leaned in, and kissed him. I turned around and walked away before I did something I'd regret. I didn't go home right away after what I saw. Instead, I sat in my car at a gas station a few blocks away, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding, not from shock. I wasn't in shock anymore, but from the kind of rage that makes your hands shake and your vision blur. I wanted to go back, to confront them right then and there, to drag Jason out of his overpriced car and make sure he never looked at my wife again. But I stopped myself because anger alone wasn't enough. I needed more than anger. I needed control. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Emily was already home. She was in the kitchen, acting like nothing had happened, slicing up fruit for one of her ridiculous morning smoothies. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up like any other morning, like she hadn't just been in another man's arms less than an hour ago. "Hey, you're up early," she said, tossing a piece of banana into the blender. "I thought you were sleeping in today." I forced myself to look at her like I always did, to act like I wasn't picturing her hands on him, her lips against his. "Couldn't sleep," I said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. Figured I'd get an early start on the day. She nodded, turning back to her smoothie, blending it like this was just another normal day in our marriage. And maybe, for her, it was. Maybe she thought she had been careful enough, that I was still the oblivious husband who trusted her without question. I let her believe that. For the next few days, I watched her more closely than I ever had before. I started noticing the little things, the way she kept her phone on silent, how she always tilted the screen away from me when she texted, the way she'd leave the house at odd hours, saying she needed to clear her head, but coming back looking more relaxed than she had in months. I didn't say anything, not yet. I just observed. Because the worst part wasn't even the affair itself, it was the realization that she didn't feel guilty. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. She had made her choice. She just hadn't told me yet. I decided I wasn't going to be the fool who waited for her to come clean. If she wanted to live a double life, then I'd make sure she felt the consequences of it. That's why I followed her again. This time, I was smarter about it. Instead of trailing her myself, I borrowed a friend's car, something she wouldn't recognize. I parked a few blocks from our house and waited. Sure enough, at exactly 10:30, she left, dressed in her usual running gear, earbuds in, looking every bit like a woman who just wanted to get some exercise. I already knew where she was going, so I took a different route and got there before her. I parked where I had a clear view of Jason's car and sat back, waiting. It didn't take long. A few minutes later, Emily walked up, taking out her earbuds and slipping her phone into her jacket pocket. Jason stepped out of his car, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. This time, I didn't look away. I watched as he reached for her, as she leaned into him, as they stood there for a moment, wrapped up in each other like nothing else existed. I took out my phone and started recording. I didn't need to see more. I had enough. Enough to prove it to myself, enough to destroy whatever fantasy she had built up in her head that this was harmless, that she could keep living in two worlds without consequence. I didn't feel sad as I drove home. I didn't feel heartbroken. I just felt done. When Emily came back an hour later, she was humming to herself, a small smile on her face like she had just finished the best run of her life. She kicked off her shoes at the door and stretched, rolling her shoulders like nothing in the world could touch her. "You should come with me next time," she said, walking into the kitchen. "It's nice out today." I leaned against the counter, watching her pour herself a glass of water, her movements relaxed, casual. "Maybe I will," I said, my voice calm. "Might be nice to see the trail myself." She glanced at me, her expression unreadable for half a second before she nodded. "Yeah, it's a great spot." I held back a laugh because I knew, in that moment, she had no idea. No idea that I had seen everything. No idea that I had evidence. No idea that her entire world was about to come crashing down. I didn't wait long before making my move because the more time passed, the more I could feel the anger burning inside me, and I wasn't the kind of man who could swallow something like this and pretend everything was fine. I had spent days watching her lie to my face, walking around this house like she was still my wife while she was sneaking off with another man. The way she hummed to herself after coming home from seeing him, the way she stretched like she had no weight on her shoulders, like she wasn't carrying a secret that would tear everything apart, it made me sick. I wanted to throw it all in her face and watch the carefully crafted world she built crumble right in front of her. That night, I waited until she was comfortable, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. I sat across from her, watching as she sipped, looking relaxed, probably thinking about him, probably texting him. I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for her to notice I was staring. When she finally looked up, she raised an eyebrow, amused at first, like I was being weird for no reason. "What?" she asked, setting her glass down on the table. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the video I had recorded earlier. "Tell me about your run today," I said, my voice calm, controlled. She blinked, and for a second, I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out why I was asking. Same as usual," she said, shrugging. "Why?" I didn't answer right away. I just kept looking at her, watching her squirm under my stare. "What's the name of that trail again?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a second, but I caught it. "Maple Ridge," she said. I nodded slowly. That's funny." She frowned, her fingers curling slightly against her thigh. "What's funny?" I turned my phone screen toward her and pressed play. The video started with a clear shot of Jason standing by his car, waiting. Then, Emily walking up, the way she took out her earbuds, the way she smiled as she slipped her phone into her pocket, the way he reached for her, pulling her in. The way she let him. The way she kissed him. I didn't take my eyes off her as she watched the video, the color draining from her face in real time. Her mouth opened slightly, then shut, her breathing picking up, her hands pressing into her lap like she was trying to ground herself. When the video ended, the room was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Explain," I said. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting, but nothing came out at first. Then, she shook her head like she could somehow shake off the reality of what she had just seen. "It's not," she started, but I cut her off before she could even try. "Don't you dare say it's not what it looks like," I said, my voice low, firm. "I'm not an idiot, Emily." She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair, shifting in her seat like she wanted to get up but didn't know if she should. She started again, then sighed. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, so you just accidentally tripped and fell into his arms? You accidentally kissed him? You accidentally snuck around behind my back for who knows how long?" She swallowed, looking anywhere but at me. "I was unhappy," she said, her voice softer now, like she thought that would make a difference. I felt my hands clench into fists. "Unhappy," I repeated. "And your solution to that was to screw around with some guy instead of talking to me? Instead of trying to fix whatever you thought was wrong?" Tears welled up in her eyes now, but I wasn't about to let her turn this into a sob story about how hard things were for her. "I didn't plan this, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking. "It just happened." I stood up so fast she flinched, my chair scraping against the floor. "Don't give me that bullshit," I snapped. "People don't just fall into affairs. They make choices. You made a choice every single time you saw him, every time you lied to my face, every time you snuck around. You knew exactly what you were doing, Emily." She wiped at her face, her shoulders shaking now, but I didn't care. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. I laughed again, but this time, it was full of nothing but bitterness. "Yeah? Well, congratulations, because you did." She finally looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes, like she was realizing just how badly she had fucked up, like she had convinced herself she could keep this secret forever and never have to face the consequences. But here they were, staring her in the face, and she had nowhere to run. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, because there was still one thing I needed to know. "How long?" I asked. She hesitated again, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter." I slammed my fist against the table, making her jump. "How long, Emily?" She took a shaky breath, then finally, barely above a whisper, she said it. 6 months. 6 months. I stared at her, my mind running through every moment of the past half-year, every time I kissed her, touched her, told her I loved her, completely unaware that she had already checked out of our marriage and given herself to someone else. I nodded slowly, stepping back from the table. "All right," I said. "That's all I needed to know." Her eyes widened, panic setting in now. "Daniel, please." But I was already walking away, done listening to her excuses, done looking at her, done pretending that the woman sitting in front of me was the same person I had married. I spent the next 24 hours in silence, moving through the house like Emily wasn't even there, ignoring every attempt she made to talk to me, brushing past her like she was nothing more than furniture in my way. She tried everything, tears, apologies, explanations that didn't matter, pathetic justifications about how she had felt lonely, how she had been confused, how it wasn't about me, how it was just something that happened. I refused to give her anything because she didn't deserve it. If she thought she could break our marriage apart and still get some emotional closure for herself, she was dead wrong. She could sit in the wreckage and figure it out on her own because I wasn't going to be the one to help her process the consequences of her own actions. By the next morning, I had already decided what needed to be done. I wasn't just going to leave her. That would have been too easy. I wanted her to feel this. I wanted her to lose more than just me. I wanted her to watch everything she had built outside of this marriage collapse just like she had collapsed everything between us. So I started where it would hurt her the most, her reputation. Emily had built her entire career on her image. As a marketing consultant, she had always branded herself as someone who understood relationships, both in business and in life, someone who helped others connect, who knew how to create trust between clients and companies. It was all bullshit, and now everyone would see that. I gathered everything, screenshots of the video, details of where and when I had caught them, messages between her and Jason that I had managed to retrieve from our shared laptop that she had been careless enough to sync her accounts to. I didn't blast it all over social media because that would have been too reckless, too messy. No, I went straight to the people who mattered in her world. Her boss, her biggest clients, The people who hired her because they thought she was someone who understood loyalty and trust. I sent it all with a simple message. If she can lie to the person she promised her life to, what makes you think she won't lie to you? The fallout was immediate. The moment she realized what I had done, she came running into the living room, her phone in her shaking hands, her face pale as she read through the responses, the sudden withdrawals from clients, the termination of contracts, the polite but firm messages from her boss saying they needed to talk immediately. She turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief, like she hadn't just spent 6 months betraying me, like she actually thought I was the kind of man who would walk away quietly and let her move on with her life unscathed. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I leaned back in my chair, watching her, letting her sit in the panic, letting her feel even a fraction of what I had felt when I first realized what she had done to me. "What needed to be done?" I said, my voice calm. Her hands clenched into fists, her entire body trembling now. She started, but she couldn't even finish the sentence. I tilted my head, waiting. "What, Emily?" What?" I fought back. "I didn't just let you get away with it. I made sure you felt what it was like to lose something." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't the kind that came from guilt. No, this was fear. Fear of losing her career, fear of losing everything she had built outside of me, fear of the reality that the life she thought she had outside of our marriage was crumbling just as fast as the one she had inside of it. "I didn't deserve this," she choked out. That made me laugh. "You didn't deserve this?" I repeated, standing up now, my rage boiling to the surface again. "You didn't deserve this, Emily? You threw away 10 years of marriage for a cheap fling, and you think you're the victim here." She flinched, her shoulders shaking now, but I didn't care. I stepped closer, forcing her to look at me. "You had a choice. You could have talked to me. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you lied, you cheated, and you destroyed everything we built together. And now, what? You're upset because there are consequences?" She shook her head violently, trying to catch her breath. "I didn't mean for this to happen. You have to understand it." "I don't have to understand anything," I interrupted. "The only thing I have to do is make sure you don't get to walk away from this untouched." She took a step back, gripping her phone like it was the only thing holding her together. "You ruined my career," she whispered, her voice cracking. I exhaled, shaking my head in disgust. "No, Emily. You ruined your career. I just made sure people saw who you really are." She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, sobbing like the world had ended. And maybe, for her, it had. But for me, this was just the beginning. Emily stayed on the couch for a long time, barely moving, barely breathing, her hands still clutching her phone like she was waiting for some miracle to undo everything I had set in motion. But no messages came. No calls. No offers of reassurance from her clients or coworkers. There was nothing but silence. And in that silence, I watched her fall apart. It was fitting. I had spent days feeling like my world had collapsed beneath me, so now she could feel what it was like to have everything she thought was stable ripped out from under her. Eventually, she sat up, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater, her movement slow, shaky. She still wouldn't look at me. "So what now?" she asked, her voice hollow, her fingers tightening around her phone before she set it down on the coffee table, like even she knew that whatever she was hoping for wasn't coming. I exhaled, leaning against the arm of the chair, studying her, letting the weight of her question hang in the air between us. "What do you mean?" She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You've already taken everything, Daniel. My job, my reputation. What else is left?" I felt nothing as I watched her, not anger, not pity, just a deep, unwavering certainty in what had to happen next. "The marriage," I said finally. "That's what's left." Her breath hitched slightly, her fingers twitching against the fabric of her jeans, and for the first time in days, she actually looked at me, her eyes searching mine like she thought there was still a chance to fix this. "You're really divorcing me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." She blinked rapidly, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She knew she had no ground to stand on. "Just like that." I nodded. "Just like that." Her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her breathing uneven now. "I never wanted this," she whispered. I shook my head, disgust creeping into my voice. "You never wanted this, but you did everything to make sure it happened. You had 6 months, Emily. 6 months to stop. 6 months to tell me the truth. 6 months to make a different choice. But you didn't. So don't sit there and act like this isn't exactly what you set in motion." She squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body tensed like she was trying to hold herself together. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, barely above a whisper. That was what finally made me laugh, a sharp, humorless sound that filled the space between us. You lost me the moment you touched him, I said. Tears slipped down her cheeks again, and for a moment, she just sat there, staring at the floor like if she stayed still enough, if she cried hard enough, maybe I'd change my mind. But I wouldn't. There was nothing left to change. I don't know what to do, she finally admitted, her voice small. I stood up, looking down at her, at the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with, the woman who had destroyed all of it without a second thought. Figure it out, I said, turning toward the hallway. Done with this conversation, done with her, done with everything. She didn't call after me. She didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, alone, in the mess she had created. Packing my things didn't take long, which only reminded me how little I really needed from this place. Most of the furniture had been hers before we got married. The dishes were things we had picked out together but never really cared about, and the photos that once meant something were just empty decorations now. I grabbed my clothes, my laptop, a few personal things that actually mattered, and that was it. I didn't feel sadness as I zipped up my bags or looked around the house one last time. There was nothing left here for me. Emily hovered near the kitchen, watching me with red-rimmed eyes like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. For the first time, she seemed to realize that this wasn't just an argument, not just something that would blow over after a few days of silence. She had broken something permanent, and now she was watching me walk away from it. You don't have to leave tonight, she finally said, her voice hesitant, uneven. I pulled my bag over my shoulder, shaking my head. Yeah, I do. She exhaled slowly, her arms crossing over her stomach like she was trying to hold herself together. Where are you even going? I met her eyes, feeling nothing but exhaustion now. Does it matter? She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, to tell me that it did, but then she stopped herself, realizing that whatever she said wouldn't change anything. I never wanted this, she whispered again, like repeating it would somehow make it true. I sighed, adjusting the strap of my bag. Yeah, you said that already. She flinched at my tone, and for a second, she looked like she was about to cry again, but I didn't have the energy to care. If she wanted to cry, she could. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the fact that she had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. I walked to the door, and she followed, stopping just a few steps behind me. Are you ever going to talk to me again? I paused, my hand on the doorknob, considering the question for a moment. Maybe someday, if she needed something important, if there were loose ends to tie up. But not because she wanted to clear her conscience, not because she wanted to rewrite what had happened in a way that made it easier for her to live with herself. I don't know, I finally said. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. I loved you. I nodded once, opening the door. I wish that had been enough. I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me without looking back.